Mark Fisher. Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative? Chapter 8. There's no central exchange. Although excoriated by both neoliberalism and neoconservatism, the concept of the nanny state continues to haunt capitalist realism. The specter of big government plays an essential libidinal function for capitalist realism. It is there to be blamed precisely for its failure to act as a centralizing power, the anger directed at it much like the fury Thomas Hardy supposedly spat at God for not existing. Time and again, James Meek observed in an LRB piece on water privatization in Britain, Conservative and Labour governments have discovered that when they give powers to private companies, and those private companies screw up, voters blame the government for giving the powers away, rather than the companies for misusing them. Meek was visiting Tewkesbury, one of the British towns that was the victim of serious flooding in 2007, a year after the disaster. On the face of it, the flooding and the consequent failure of services was the fault of privatized water companies and house builders, yet Meek found that this was not the way that most of the local residents saw it. In Tewkesbury, Meeks wrote, "In general there is more hostility towards the government, the council and the Environment Agency for not stopping house builders than there is towards house builders for building houses, or buyers for buying them. When insurers raise their premiums, more blame is directed at the government for not spending enough on flood defenses than at insurers for raising the premiums, or at people who choose to live in a flood-prone valley but don't like paying extra for it." This syndrome was repeated on a much grander scale with a disaster of a different kind, the bank crisis of 2008. The media focus was on the excesses of individual bankers and on the government's handling of the crisis, not on the systemic causes of the crisis. I don't for a moment want to excuse New Labour for its part in such disasters, but it has to be recognized that focus on government, like the focus on immoral individuals, is an act of deflection. Scapegoating an impotent government, running around to clean up the messes made by its business friends, arises from bad faith, from a continuing hostility to the nanny state that nevertheless goes alongside a refusal to accept the consequences of the sidelining of government in global capitalism, a sign, perhaps, that, at the level of the political unconscious, it is impossible to accept that there are no overall controllers, that the closest thing we have to ruling powers now are nebulous, unaccountable interests exercising corporate irresponsibility. A case of fetishist disavowal, perhaps. We know perfectly well that the government is not pulling the strings, but nevertheless. The disavowal happens in part because the centralessness of global capitalism is radically unthinkable. Although people are interpellated now as consumers, and, as Wendy Brown and others have pointed out, government itself is presented as a kind of commodity or service, they still cannot help but think of themselves as, if they were, citizens. The closest that most of us come to a direct experience of the centralessness of capitalism is an encounter with the call center. As a consumer in late capitalism, you increasingly exist in two distinct realities, the one in which the services are provided without hitch, and another reality entirely, the crazed Kafkaesque labyrinth of call centers, a world without memory, where cause and effect connect together in mysterious, unfathomable ways, where it is a miracle that anything ever happens, and you lose hope of ever passing back over to the other side, where things seem to function smoothly. What exemplifies the failure of the neoliberal world to live up to its own PR better than the call center? Even so, the universality of bad experiences with call centers does nothing to unsettle the operating assumption that capitalism is inherently efficient, as if the problems with call centers weren't the systemic consequences of a logic of capital, which means organizations are so fixated on making profits that they can't actually sell you anything. The call center experience distills the political phenomenology of late capitalism, the boredom and frustration punctuated by cheerily piped PR, the repeating of the same dreary details many times to different poorly trained and badly informed operatives, the building rage that must remain impotent because it can have no legitimate object, since, as is very quickly clear to the caller, there is no one who knows, and no one who could do anything even if they could. Anger can only be a matter of venting, it is aggression in a vacuum, directed at someone who is a fellow victim of the system but with whom there is no possibility of communality. Just as the anger has no proper object, it will have no effect. In this experience of a system that is unresponsive, impersonal, centerless, abstract, and fragmentary, you are as close as you can be to confronting the artificial stupidity of capital in itself. Call center angst is one more illustration of the way that Kafka is poorly understood as exclusively a writer on totalitarianism. A decentralized, market Stalinist bureaucracy is far more Kafkaesque than one in which there is a central authority. Read, for instance, the bleak farce of K.'s encounter with the telephone system in the castle, and it is hard not to see it as uncannily prophetic of the call center experience. There's no fixed exchange with the castle, no central exchange which transmits our calls further. When anybody calls up the castle from here, the instruments in all the subordinate departments ring, or rather they would ring if practically all the departments, I know this for a certainty, didn't leave their receivers off. Now and then, however, a fatigued official may feel the need of a little distraction, especially in the evenings and at night, and may hang the receiver on. Then we get an answer, but of course an answer that's a practical joke. And that's very understandable too. For who would take the responsibility of interrupting, in the middle of the night, the extremely important work that goes on furiously the whole time, with a message about his own private troubles? I can't comprehend how even a stranger can imagine that when he calls up Sordini, for example, it's Sordini that answers. KS response anticipates the bewildered frustration of the individual in the call center labyrinth. Although many of the conversations with call center operatives appear dadaistically nonsensical, they cannot be treated as such, cannot be dismissed as being of no significance. I didn't know it was like that, certainly, said K. I couldn't know of all these peculiarities, but I didn't put much confidence in those telephone conversations, and I was always aware that the only things of any importance were those that happened in the castle itself. No, said the superintendent, holding firmly onto the word, these telephone replies from the castle certainly have a meaning, why shouldn't they? How could a message given by an official from the castle not be important? The supreme genius of Kafka was to have explored the negative etiology proper to capital. The center is missing, but we cannot stop searching for it or positing it. It is not that there is nothing there, it is that what is there is not capable of exercising responsibility. This problem is addressed from another angle in a paper by Campbell-Jones entitled The Subject Supposed to Recycle. In posing the question, who is the subject supposed to recycle? Jones denaturalizes an imperative that is now so taken for granted that resisting it seems senseless, never mind unethical. Everyone is supposed to recycle, no one, whatever their political persuasion, ought to resist this injunction. The demand that we recycle is precisely posited as a pre- or post-ideological imperative, in other words, it is positioned in precisely the space where ideology always does its work. But the subject supposed to recycle, Jones argued, presupposed the structure not supposed to recycle. In making recycling the responsibility of everyone, structure contracts out its responsibility to consumers, by itself receding into invisibility. Now, when the appeal to individual ethical responsibility has never been more clamorous, in her book Frames of War, Judith Butler uses the term responsibilization to refer to this phenomenon. It is necessary to wager instead on structure at its most totalizing. Instead of saying that everyone, i.e. everyone, is responsible for climate change, we all have to do our bit, it would be better to say that no one is, and that's the very problem. The cause of eco-catastrophe is an impersonal structure which, even though it is capable of producing all manner of effects, is precisely not a subject capable of exercising responsibility. The required subject, a collective subject, does not exist, yet the crisis, like all the other global crises we're now facing, demands that it be constructed. Yet the appeal to ethical immediacy that has been in place in British political culture since at least 1985, when the consensual sentimentality of Live Aid replaced the antagonism of the miners' strike, permanently defers the emergence of such a subject. Similar issues are touched on in a paper by Armin Bevrungen on Alan Pakula's 1974 film The Parallax View, which sees the parallax view as providing a kind of diagram of the way in which a certain model of business ethics goes wrong. The problem is that the model of individual responsibility assumed by most versions of ethics have little purchase on the behavior of capital or corporations. The Parallax View is in a sense a meta-conspiracy film, a film not only about conspiracies but about the impotence of attempts to uncover them, or, much worse than that, about the way in which particular kinds of investigation feed the very conspiracies they intend to uncover. It is not only that the Warren Beatty character is framed/killed for the crime he is investigating, neatly eliminating him and undermining his investigations with one pull of a corporate assassin's trigger, it's that, as Jameson noted in his commentary on the film in the Geopolitical Aesthetic, his very tenacity, quasi-sociopathic individualism, make him eminently frameable. The terrifying climactic moment of the Parallax View, when the silhouette of Beatty's anonymous assassin appears against migraine white space, for me now rhymes with the open door at the end of a very different film, Peter Weir's The Truman Show. But where the door in the horizon opening onto black space at the end of Weir's film connotes a break in a universe of total determinism, the nothingness on which existentialist freedom depends, the Parallax View's final open door, opens onto a world conspiratorially organized and controlled as far as the eye can see, Jameson. This anonymous figure with a rifle in a doorway is the closest we get to seeing the conspiracy, as, itself. The conspiracy in the parallax view never gives any account of itself. It is never focalized through a single malign individual. Although presumably corporate, the interests and motives of the conspiracy in the parallax view are never articulated, perhaps not even to or by those actually involved in it. Who knows what the parallax corporation really wants? It is itself situated in the parallax between politics and economy. Is it a commercial front for political interests, or is the whole machinery of government a front for it? It's not clear if the corporation really exists. More than that, it is not clear if its aim is to pretend that it doesn't exist, or to pretend that it does. There are certainly conspiracies in capitalism, but the problem is that they are themselves only possible because of deeper level structures that allow them to function. Does anyone really think, for instance, that things would improve if we replaced the whole managerial and banking class with a whole new set of better people? Surely, on the contrary, it is evident that the vices are engendered by the structure, and that while the structure remains, the vices will reproduce themselves. The strength of Pakula's film is precisely to invoke the shadowy, centerless impersonality proper to a corporate conspiracy. As Jameson observes, what Pakula captures so well in the parallax view is a particular kind of corporate affective tonality. For the agents of conspiracy, Zargakonern is a matter of smiling confidence, and the preoccupation is not personal but corporate, concern for the vitality of the network or the institution, a disembodied distraction or inattentiveness engaging the absent space of the collective organization itself without the clumsy conjectures that sap the energies of the victims. These people know, and are therefore able to invest their presence as characters in an intense yet complacent attention whose center of gravity is elsewhere, a rapt intentness which is at the same time disinterest. Yet this very different type of concern, equally depersonalized, carries its own specific anxiety with it, as it were unconsciously and corporately, without any consequences for the individual villains. Without any consequences for the individual villains. How that phrase resonates just now, after the deaths of Jean-Charles de Menezes and Ian Tomlinson and after the banking fiasco. And what Jameson is describing here is the mortifying cocoon of corporate structure, which deadens as it protects, which hollows out, absents, the manager, ensures that their attention is always displaced, ensures that they cannot listen. The delusion that many who enter into management with high hopes is precisely that they, the individual, can change things, that they will not repeat what their managers had done, that things will be different this time, but watch someone step up into management and it's usually not very long before the grey petrification of power starts to subsume them. It is here that structure is palpable, you can practically see it taking people over, hear its deadening judgments speaking through them. For this reason, it is a mistake to rush to impose the individual ethical responsibility that the corporate structure deflects. This is the temptation of the ethical which, as Zizek has argued, the capitalist system is using in order to protect itself in the wake of the credit crisis. The blame will be put on supposedly pathological individuals, those abusing the system, rather than on the system itself. But the evasion is actually a two-step procedure, since structure will often be invoked, either implicitly or openly, precisely at the point when there is the possibility of individuals who belong to the corporate structure being punished. At this point, suddenly, the causes of abuse or atrocity are so systemic, so diffuse, that no individual can be held responsible. This was what happened with the Hillsborough football disaster, the Jean-Charles de Menezes farce and so many other cases. But this impasse, it is only individuals that can be held ethically responsible for actions, and yet the cause of these abuses and errors is corporate, systemic, is not only a dissimulation, it precisely indicates what is lacking in capitalism. What agencies are capable of regulating and controlling impersonal structures? How is it possible to chastise a corporate structure? Yes, corporations can legally be treated as individuals, but the problem is that corporations, whilst certainly entities, are not like individual humans, and any analogy between punishing corporations and punishing individuals will therefore necessarily be poor. And it is not as if corporations are the deep-level agents behind everything, they are themselves constrained by expressions of the ultimate cause that is not as subject, capital.